Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club as we continue our reading of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed, the true and unforgettable story of faith and miraculous deliverance in communist China at the height of the Cultural Revolution, written by Stanley Maxwell. In our last reading, we covered chapters 14 and 15, where Mr. Wang was subjected to a mock public trial before a judge and a panel of prosecutors, and attended by a crowd of students gathered to learn about the politics of now communist China. Mr. Wang was convicted of counter-revolutionary activity, rumor-mongering, and being a spy for both America and the former Kuomintang regime, and sentenced to 20 years hard labor. Along with the other prisoners, his crimes were written on a large placard hung around his neck, and they were paraded around the streets of Shanghai in the back of open trucks, with their names and crimes being broadcast over loudspeakers. Knowing he was not a criminal, Mr. Wang kept his head high during this ordeal until they arrived at the train station where they would be transported to the hard labor camp. The train ride lasted 7 days, and then they were loaded onto trucks to finish the journey, which took over a month. On all parts of the journey, they endured the harshest of conditions, and many prisoners died, either from exhaustion or from being shot while trying to escape. When the trucks could go no further because of the terrain, they were forced to walk. They were at a very high altitude, and many suffered altitude sickness. After walking for a day, they came to the camp, which was no camp at all, just a wide open space in the most desolate of locations, with not a building in sight. They were forced to sleep on the cold ground with no shelter. We continue our reading today with chapter 16, entitled A Taste of Hard Labor Camp, and chapter 17, entitled Praying Under the Gun. Chapter 16, A Taste of Hard Labor Camp. No one was given food the next morning. The guards arranged the prisoners for exercises and roll call, and issued communal work assignments. Criminals are required to meet daily quotas, a guard lectured. If any criminal doesn't meet his quota, he'll be punished. There'll be no leniency and no exceptions. Calling the prisoners by name, he assigned some to dig an underground burrow for living quarters, and others to clean out a corral for some neighboring nomads. Criminals in this unit will pick up the dried sheep, goat, and yak droppings and cart the dung to the camp to be used for fuel, to bake bricks and cook meals. Then Mr. Wang heard his name called. This unit will make bricks. Each inmate should form 500 bricks a day or be solely responsible for the consequences. A guard supervised Mr. Wang's work unit. First, we need an adobe wall to surround the area, he ordered. They used the dirt from the excavating to form bricks. Mr. Wang felt as though he were an Israelite slave in Pharaoh's Egypt, mixing straw and mud. Though they toiled the entire day, no one was given any food. The hungry prisoners salivated, watching the guards eat. Though his stomach ached, Mr. Wang remembered the walk home from church when his family had no food, and little Doll had declared it a time to fast. He found comfort, despite stomach cramps, following his daughter's example and declaring his first day in camp a day of fasting. At the end of the day, The guards calculated the number of bricks each prisoner had made. 2 of the inmates in Mr. Wang's unit had fallen short of their quota. "What did the superintendent say this morning?" one of the guards barked. "Criminals should make 500 bricks," the prisoner replied. "Why did you disobey orders?" The guilty inmates said nothing. "Come with me," the guard commanded. Mr. Wang watched. The guard led the 2 prisoners to the hole that had been dug by the cave-digging team. He slapped one of the prisoners on the back of the head. "Take off your shoe," he ordered. The prisoner took off a shoe and handed it to the guard. "I don't want it," the guard snapped. "Give it to your friend." The prisoner handed his shoe to the other inmate, who took it. "Now bend down," the guard ordered the prisoner with the bare foot. The inmate leaned over. The guard turned to the prisoner holding the shoe. "Smack him with the shoe and shout, 'Why didn't you meet your quota?' And don't stop until you're tired. When you need a rest, remove your shoe and trade places with him. He'll hit you and shout about your laziness. Trade off until I give you permission to stop." The prisoners beat each other all evening until they were exhausted and hoarse. About midnight, the guard returned. "Are you going to meet your quota tomorrow?" "Oh, yes," they chorused. "Promise?" "We promise," they croaked. "Thank you for teaching us this valuable lesson about quotas. Please forgive us and let us sleep tonight." "All right, you can sleep now." Relieved, the men put their shoes back on and dragged themselves to a spot out of the wind where they could sleep. That night, hungry and tired, Mr. Wang talked with his friend Jesus. "Thank you for giving me the strength to meet my quota. Help me never to fall short so they can't force me to beat a fellow inmate. May I prove my loyalty to China by being a good worker." On the second day, the guards served a small ration of highland barley for supper. Though he preferred rice, Mr. Wang was grateful that at least the meal was vegetarian. That night, many stomachs growled from inadequate food and a desire for rice. To the Chinese prisoners, barley was fodder for animals. Rice was never on their menu. Day after day, varieties of barley abounded. As the excavation on the burrow continued, Mr. Wang's work unit kept making bricks, which they baked in small earthen kilns. In a few days, the prisoners began laying the brick into walls. First, they built a high wall around the entire compound. Then they built a guard tower in the center of the compound that was high enough for the guards to see over the walls. They also constructed a guardhouse and a toilet for the guards. The prisoners coated the finished walls with more mud, which, when sun-baked, was brown with specks of straw poking through. When the burrow was completed, the prisoners descended a sloping tunnel into their new underground residence, which to Mr. Wang seemed like stepping into the shadow of a grave. Inside, the guards lighted candles. After their eyes adjusted, the prisoners scanned their dimly lighted surroundings. In the center of the massive hole was a space large enough for all to stand for rallies and announcements. Across from their entrance into the burrow was an exit of equal size. These two openings allowed in a small amount of light. Large, dark niches had been carved into the walls on either side. "Each of you gets a candle," a guard explained. We'll assign you by name to the niches in the burrow with up to 15 prisoners per niche. They called the prisoner next to Mr. Wong first. He came forward to receive his candle. "Give me your bag," the guard ordered. Searching through it, he removed a blanket. Running his hand over it, he yelled, "What's this?" Tearing into the blanket, he extracted a knife. Holding it into the ear, he barked, "You think you can outsmart us? You're wrong. No weapons allowed. Nothing sharp or made of metal. Not even spoons. Your belongings will be inspected again every 6 months." When Mr. Wong's name was called, the guard took his bag and pulled out the belongings. He felt his blanket and pillowcase. Mr. Wong feared the guard might discover the hidden scriptures. The guard found nothing. After stuffing his things back in the bag, Mr. Wong proceeded to his niche. "Niche 13 is forbidden," a guard called. "The roof caved in. Some of you will die before your sentence is complete. We'll store your bodies there." Mr. Wong hurried to his niche. Candlelight revealed dirt walls with no support. Water dripped from the roof. He wondered if his niche also might collapse some night during his sleep. Other prisoners had already staked out their space. Finding an unoccupied corner, he set his bag down. With his hands, he carved a perch in the wall and set his candle on it. The other inmates followed his example. With all the candles in place, he could see to sort his belongings. Some still felt damp with urine from the long trip west. Mr. Wong set out his precious blanket with the pages of the testaments hidden inside. Pretending to adjust his blanket, he pulled out a page and stuck it into his medical book. With the aid of this book, he could memorize scripture when the guards thought he was studying medicine. He vowed never to share his secret with anyone. He needed his testaments. Without them, he knew he could not survive. For breakfast each morning, the guards lined up the prisoners in front of their niches. They squatted as the guards served them steamed rolls and cooked greens harvested from nearby fields. Mr. Wong thought mealtime was an opportune time for witnessing. He hoped his fellow inmates would ask him about his friend Jesus. Like his hero Daniel, who prayed openly 3 times daily, Mr. Wong determined to do the same. When the guards handed him his steamed roll, Mr. Wong set his plate on the ground, bowed his head, closed his eyes, and thanked God for his meager meal. When he opened his eyes, he discovered his steamed roll and vegetables had vanished. "Looking for something?" the inmate next to him said. "My food's gone." "Did you eat it?" "No." "What's the problem here?" A guard came up to Mr. Wong. "My steamed roll and vegetables are gone." "What happened?" "I closed my eyes to thank the real God for the food," Mr. Wong explained. "When I opened them, my food had disappeared." "Come with me, Criminal Wong." Mr. Wong followed the guard up the dirt steps that led outside the cave. He saw his vegetables crushed into the ground. The roll had dirty footprints stamped on it. He couldn't eat the vegetables, but the roll was salvageable. "Pick it up." Mr. Wong obeyed. He followed the guard back down into the burrow. "Do you know why this happened, Criminal Wong? Your superstition angered a prisoner. He despised you because you thanked a God who does not exist for the food the government issued you." Everyone heard the guard's loud accusations. "Your God didn't give you the food. Your government did. I'm very disappointed in your ungratefulness, Criminal Wang. Your kind government takes care of the Christians and Muslims in the camp. The Muslims get their special food with enough oil and clean vegetables. They show appreciation for our great favor of kindness by kneeling at our feet and kissing our hands. Why don't you thank your government instead of your so-called real God? When a prisoner saw your ingratitude towards the party, he thought you didn't deserve to eat, so he dashed outside and stomped on your steamed roll. Learn your lesson and give up your superstition. My friend Jesus made it possible for the government to serve us this food, Mr. Wang answered. Everything belongs to him, even the cattle on 1,000 hills. The cooks gave you this food, the guard snapped. Hoping he might get another ration, Mr. Wang looked forlornly at his crushed steamed roll coated with dirt. Eat it, the guard ordered. We have no more steamed rolls today. Eat or starve. A few of the inmates laughed. Mr. Wang stuck the filthy steamed roll in his mouth and started chewing. The bland dough stuck on the roof of his mouth, and grit and dirt crunched in his teeth, but he swallowed it all. At his next meal, Mr. Wang boldly bowed his head again, closed his eyes, and thanked the real God for his food. Again, his steamed roll was missing. Are you persisting in your superstition? A guard growled. You're in prison for re-education, to learn from your gracious government, but you stubbornly refuse to be taught. Go get your roll. Mr. Wang retrieved his roll, stepped back down into the cave, and ate without complaining. How do you like dirty food? A guard joked. You know you can end your problem easily. Give up your feudalistic superstition, and you won't offend the prisoners. The guard was right, Mr. Wang thought. He could compromise and say grace without bowing his head or closing his eyes. But then he wouldn't be witnessing. Munching on the soiled steamed roll, Mr. Wang knew the prisoners had gained merit for stealing his rolls. He could imagine the scenario. When he closed his eyes, a prisoner looked toward the guard. If the guard looked away, he had permission. Quickly, he'd snatch the food and dash outside with it. As the days turned into months, Mr. Wang grew accustomed to the guard's lecture and the jaunt to the surface every mealtime after blessing his food. Though he didn't appreciate the gritty food, he knew many watched him. Mr. Wang promised the real God that more guards and inmates had become aware of his friendship with Jesus. After 6 months of eating smashed food, one day, Mr. Wang opened his eyes after saying grace and discovered his steamed roll on his plate, untouched. He closed his eyes again and thanked his friend for delivering him from persecution. He could bless his food in peace. Subsequent meals were also left alone. Maybe both guards and inmates had decided there was nothing they could do. How long must he wait before someone would ask him about his friend Jesus? As time went on, the menu changed. In addition to the steamed roll, the guards included pieces of coagulated lard and pork in barley meal. Pork could be another way to witness that might encourage his inmates to ask him about the real God. Greedily, the inmates stuffed the pork and barley with coagulated lard into their mouths, shouting, This is the first sign of real food we have eaten in months. Mr. Wang ate his steamed roll, but he ignored the pork. A burly inmate stood up, walked over, slapped him across the face and demanded, "Why aren't you eating, old Wang? You haven't touched your barley." "I'm a Christian," Mr. Wang explained, knowing that others were listening. "There's pork and lard in it. True Christians don't eat pork." "Guard!" he shouted over his shoulder. "This ungrateful pig isn't eating." "What's the trouble?" the guard bellowed. "This man says true Christians won't eat pork." "Why do you stubbornly cling to your superstition?" The guard bent close to Mr. Wang's face. "Isn't it enough that you thank your so-called real God for your food, and now you arrogantly refuse to eat it?" "Shall I help him eat?" Mr. Wang saw the inmate look into the guard's eyes, hoping to gain favor. "We Chinese eat pork and lard. How can you eat without pork? The taste isn't so good." "I cannot eat pork or lard," Mr. Wang said. "The real God taught us that the flesh of the pig is unclean for eating." "Listen to your fellow prisoners. They give good advice. Eat the pork," the guard urged. "It's just little pieces of pork. It won't hurt you." The prisoner picked up some of Mr. Wang's chopsticks and put it to Mr. Wang's mouth. "Eat it." "I'm sorry," Mr. Wang replied, "but I can't eat even a little bit of lard or pork." "If you do what your God says and follow the decadent Western influences from the missionaries who brainwashed you, you'll starve to death," the guard coaxed. "Your God isn't your savior. He's killing you. Give up this deadly superstition. Eat pork and live for a long time." Mr. Wang saw renewed eye contact between the guard and the burly prisoner, which showed that the irritated inmate was itching to rough up Mr. Wang. But to do so, he needed an approving signal from the guard. "Shall I feed it to him? I'll make him eat it." The guard looked down at Mr. Wang and wrinkled his lips and nose into a sneer. That was the signal the brute needed. "Criminal Wang, learn from your new friend. He seems concerned about you." The guard stepped away a safe distance, but close enough to supervise the prisoner's deeds without taking part. Mr. Wang sized up his opponent and knew that with his police training and sniper experience, he could win a fight. But that wasn't the Christian way. "My God," he prayed, "stifle my natural instincts. Strengthen me to be a true Christian example." "I've never met a Chinese who didn't eat pork or lard." "You're very strange," the furious prisoner sneered. "Cooperate with me. Just eat it. It's good for you." The prisoner put pork and lard to Mr. Wang's mouth, but Mr. Wang refused to open it. He scanned the cave for the guard who had given the go-ahead look. The other prisoner picked up Mr. Wang and threw him to the ground, then sat on his stomach and reached for the pork. A crowd gathered. "Don't make it hard for yourself." The prisoner leaned forward until Mr. Wang could feel his hot breath against his face. "Open your mouth." Mr. Wang refused. The guard pressed his way through the crowd. "Criminal Wang, you're upsetting everyone and drawing undue attention to yourself. Eat the pork." Mr. Wang made no move to resist, nor did he open his mouth. He just closed his eyes and prayed silently to his friend. Then a gruff hand grabbed his cheeks and pressed them together until his mouth opened. The prisoner on top of him stuffed the pork into his mouth. "Eat it!" Mr. Wang spat out the mouthful. It fell back on his face and his chest. "You stubborn old fool!" The inmate slapped Mr. Wang. "Must I teach you to eat?" He pried open Mr. Wang's mouth and crammed pork into it. Then he pushed his jaw up and down. Sticking his finger down Mr. Wang's throat, he forced him to gag enough to swallow. This he repeated, bite after bite, until all the pork and lard were gone. "How did it taste? Good?" With his task completed, the prisoner looked into the approving eyes of the guard. He stood and stepped away from Mr. Wang, leaving him lying on the ground. "Next time, old Wang, eat your food yourself." The crowd dispersed. Mr. Wang had a bad taste in his mouth and pity in his heart. He pulled himself off the ground, walked over to the wall where the men urinated, stuck his finger down his throat, and vomited everything up. His empty stomach and the taste of vomit in his mouth were only slightly better than the pork or lard, but the meat was out of his system. He had won the fight without swinging a blow. As the days passed, the quantity of food decreased. At mealtime, when the prisoners assembled in the center of the cave, a guard announced, "Due to circumstances beyond the control of the People's Benevolent Dictatorship, this region of the country is experiencing a slight drought. Your kind government is unable to produce the rations it desires, so everyone must suffer. We jailers have graciously devised a plan to fill the slack for you criminals. Inmate physician Lai has searched the nearby fields and gathered edible herbs, berries, and mushrooms. A work unit will be assigned to harvest them. But first, Criminal Lai will explain the task." Dr. Lai explained, "I've identified 27 varieties of edible plants. However, many grasses, herbs, and berries and mushrooms are poisonous." Setting a bag on the ground, he produced a number of plants, showing which ones were edible and which were not. Lifting up a mushroom that looked particularly edible to Mr. Wang, the doctor declared, "Don't eat this one. It holds swift death. Once ingested, your face will swell, then your neck. By the time the swelling reaches your chest, you'll be dead." After all the prisoners had examined the plants, Dr. Lai cautioned, "If you want to live long, you must be careful to pick only the 27 varieties I've shown you. Harvesting the wrong plants will lead to someone's death. You could be the unlucky one." Mr. Wang was assigned to the group that harvested the grass and small plants growing near the prison grounds. A guard gave them machetes and ordered them to cut the grass. They kept their backs bent the entire day as they whacked at the plants. Each prisoner watched the others and tried to harvest a little faster, not from duty, but for fear of being punished if he didn't. Though his stomach felt empty, Mr. Wang maintained the lead. As the sun set, the prisoners knew they'd soon be escorted back to the cave. When it seemed too dark to cut more plants, they attempted to sort the toxic plants from the edible ones, then cart their harvest to the cave. The correct diagnosis of toxic greens, berries, and mushrooms was imperative, for the food they had gathered would become their evening meal. Mr. Wang separated a few plants and kept them for himself. Stashing them away quickly, he didn't have time to sort out the toxic leaves and fungi. Returning to the cave, he went into his niche, lighted his candle, and sat cross-legged in his corner and got out his bowl. He sorted through the plants he had kept back and put the non-poisonous ones in the bowl. Then he poured water in the bowl and crushed and stirred the plants until they formed a mushy, cold soup. Just as Mr. Wang was about to eat, a guard stepped in. "Don't eat that," he scolded. "It might kill you. Don't you know the grass is poisonous?" "This is the only food I can eat," Mr. Wang replied as he took a sip of his soup. "What's wrong with the food your government graciously gives you?" the guard snapped. "Today, the government was proud to issue its prisoners the best food." "You know I'm a vegetarian, yet you insist that I eat pork and lard. The Christian Bible teaches that not eating meat is better for people. When the real God created Adam and Eve, he told them they could eat the fruit, grains, and nuts, not animals." Mr. Wang smiled and sipped his soup noisily. "I know many Christians who eat large pieces of pork. Why don't you Seventh-day Adventists eat meat? We serve you meat because we want to help you give up your superstition." Though the other inmates appeared to be ignoring the conversation, Mr. Wang knew they were listening. "I cannot give up my friend Jesus." Mr. Wang sipped some more of his cold soup. "He's the only way to salvation. It looks to me as if your superstitious ideas will kill you. By following these feudalistic teachings, you eat poison rather than pork or lard. Your superstitions will make you crazy. My friend Jesus will protect me if I follow his teachings." Mr. Wang swallowed a mouthful of soup. The Bible tells us that when Paul was bitten by a poisonous snake, he didn't die. I'm not Paul. I may die, but if I do, I know my friend Jesus will resurrect me when he blows his trumpet, heralding his return. The guard laughed in contempt. "How can an intelligent man like you, criminal Wang, believe those fables?" "The Bible's stories are true," Mr. Wang retorted. "You're in a re-education camp to help you distinguish truth from fiction," the guard shouted. "When will you be brave enough to abandon your superstition and embrace New China?" The guard spat on the ground. "If you die from eating toxic food, it's your own fault." "The government is kind to warn me of danger." Confident that he had sorted the plants carefully, Mr. Wang smiled. Then he tipped his bowl up and gulped down the last of his soup. "Thank you for your concern. I'm sorry I cannot eat the government's pork or lard, but I'll gladly eat the government's vegetables." Squatting down, the guard sat cross-legged beside Mr. Wang. "Your government wants you to live, criminal Wang. By serving you pork and lard, it's being very good to you. Poor Chinese can eat cornmeal. They'd give anything for pork to spice their rice." "I appreciate the government's good intentions and concern for my health, but I choose to follow Daniel's example. When the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar wanted Daniel to eat meat and wine, he asked to be fed only rice, vegetables, and water for 10 days. When Nebuchadnezzar compared him with the other men in the Babylonian court, he judged him 10 times healthier and 10 times wiser. I'll be healthier too if I'm allowed to eat simple food like vegetables. You have the gall to ask special favors?" The guard arose and spat again. "Listen to me, criminal Wang. You will eat pork and lard tomorrow." He turned and stormed out of the niche. The next day, one of the prisoners force-fed Mr. Wang, but again he vomited. After another day in the field, he fixed another bowl of cold soup from the local plants and ate it. Then the menu changed. Though the other prisoners were given only the local plants, the guards still served Mr. Wang pork with lard which he refused to eat. However, the prisoners gave up force-feeding him. Mr. Wang maintained a diet of steamed rolls and cold soup. Some of the other prisoners began to lose weight or bloat up from malnutrition. Their bellies doubled in size, and their faces grew puffy. Some died from eating the vegetables because the harvesters carelessly brought in toxic plants. Their bodies were discarded in niche 13. Though his face puffed slightly, Mr. Wang looked healthier than the other prisoners. He even ate the delicious-looking mushrooms that Dr. Lai had warned about, but showed no fatal symptoms. As the days turned into months, Mr. Wang knew the guards were watching, hoping he'd get sick or die from the toxic grasses, berries, and mushrooms. But in contrast to the other inmates in his work unit, who ate the government's rations and became weaker and worked less, Mr. Wang accomplished more in a day's shift in spite of his insufficient diet. He felt the real God blessed him for his stand against pork and lard. After 6 months of harassment, the head of the guards visited Mr. Wang in his niche. "Have you eaten?" The guard's question was a rhetorical greeting as Mr. Wang mixed his cold soup. The guard asked, "How does it taste?" "Good," Mr. Wang smiled, sensing that the visit was friendly. "Would you like some?" The guard refused, so Mr. Wang ate alone. They talked of Christian beliefs and compared the similar views of the two philosophies, Marxism and Christianity. When the topic of work ethic arose, Mr. Wang told his story about the talents. Each worker was praised or condemned by the king based on the number of talents he developed, Mr. Wang concluded. Marx also taught that each worker should work as he was able, the guard said. "I've noticed you're a good worker." The Bible says, "He who does not work shall not eat." "I think Marx would have agreed," the guard said. "Is that why you work so hard?" "Yes." Looking him in the eye, the guard smiled. "I like you, Criminal Wang. You're a good man. You work hard and deserve to eat well. You're too valuable a worker to lose. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to tell the cooks to fix your meals the way you like." And he did. The end of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Praying under the gun. The wind whipped through the rolling pasture that surrounded the prison walls, chilling Mr. Wang to the bone. With their backs bent close to the ground, the two prisoners on either side of Mr. Wang raced each other to see who could whack the most weeds with their sickles. Working like beasts of burden rather than farmers, they frantically stuffed the vegetables into their baskets. Usually the fastest in his group, Mr. Wang hurried, yet his pace slackened as he avoided the toxic berries, mushrooms, and grasses. He felt concerned as he saw the others toss everything into the baskets which would be served in their meals. Without warning, he felt a smack on the back of his head. The pain shot through him. Turning, he saw a guard glaring at him. He slapped Mr. Wang twice across the face, making blood gush out of his nose. "You're a no-good worker," the guard yelled, forgetting that Mr. Wang regularly finished ahead of the other prisoners. Anger overwhelmed Mr. Wang. His instincts from his days as a policeman returned. He had once beaten many a man. Fearing he would retaliate, he fell to his knees and prayed, "Dear God, am I qualified to suffer for my friend Jesus? You know this beating is unfair. Control my emotions. I cannot. Thank you, God, for this blessing. Enable me to be happy to suffer for you." As he got up from his knees, he felt peace in his heart. Saying nothing, he forced himself to keep up with the others. He remembered the judge's order at his trial in Shanghai about obeying the gods, thinking new thoughts, and working hard to earn a lighter sentence. Since he couldn't obey when the gods ordered him to disobey God, the only way he could prove his loyalty to his government was by working hard. As he toiled at a back-breaking speed, he rejoiced that his children couldn't see him suffer. Soon the guard announced a lunch break. 30 minutes. The weary crew, too distant from the prison compound, sat in groups and ate sack lunches provided for them. Mr. Wang devoured his highland barley, steamed buns, and vegetables quickly. When he finished, he got out his medical book, turned to the cover page, and meditated on a verse he had found on one of the pages he had torn out of his testaments. Engrossed, he was surprised to see an inmate sitting next to him. "Old Wang," the prisoner said, "what can you tell me about your real God?" Mr. Wang couldn't believe his ears. Was this man sincere? Or was he a Judas, wanting to earn merit with the gods? He decided to risk sharing his friend Jesus and his 10 regulations with the man. Since they were beyond earshot of the gods, he wrote out the first regulation on toilet paper, folded it, and handed it to the inmate. "Read this," he said. "It's one of my friend Jesus' 10 regulations. When you've memorized all the words, destroy the paper. Repeat the verse by memory to me, and I'll give you the next one." Mr. Wang believed that if the prisoner memorized the verse, he could be trusted. "Don't forget to destroy the paper," he cautioned. The criminal smiled and slipped the paper into his pocket. "Thank you, old Wang." Moments later, a guard called off the break. The work unit lined up and resumed harvesting weeds. Mr. Wang, remembering his recent beating, struggled to keep several steps ahead of the others. As the inmates walked back to the compound, Mr. Wang wished the guards would compliment him for doing his job well. When he did something right, no one noticed. But if he slacked off even once, he was punished. Mr. Wang could forgive the guard, but forgiving and forgetting are different concepts. From time to time, the prisoners received mail. This day, when he entered his niche, Mr. Wang found a package from Pastor Charlie Chu. Inside were a jacket and a letter with 10 renminbi enclosed. The letter apologized that jackets were difficult to buy in Shanghai since liberation. Many of the church members had been imprisoned for re-education, making it very hard to find a coat for him. The pastor regretted that the jacket wasn't new. A church elder had sent his own spear coat. He hoped it was the right size. Mr. Wang knew the money would come in handy the next time he took a trip into town. In spite of the apparent desolation of their surroundings, there was a small town a few miles away on the other side of a mountain, and occasionally a few prisoners were allowed to go into town with the guards. The occasional mail that the prisoners received also came through this town. From time to time, Mr. Wang received precious letters from his children. These letters brought great courage to his heart, especially as he read of their continuing faithfulness to Jesus. The letters told how the church members helped the children enough that they had food and clothes they needed to survive. Mr. Wang cherished every letter. He kept them all in his suitcase and read them often. Whenever possible, he also wrote to the children, but he was careful not to say too much about the hardships he was enduring. Mr. Wang tucked the money from the latest package into his suitcase and thanked God for the thoughtfulness of his church members. He knew they had sacrificed to send him this gift. One of the other prisoners saw the money that Mr. Wang had received in the package. "Who sent you money?" he asked. "Some friends from my church in Shanghai," Mr. Wang replied with a smile. He felt happy to be able to give credit to people who loved his friend Jesus the way he did. "Your church members must be wonderful people," the other prisoner said in amazement. "How can they afford to send you 10 renminbi when salaries are so low?" Mr. Wang felt happy that some prisoners viewed his church positively, and he hoped that they'd believe in his friend Jesus. Mr. Wang especially enjoyed zuxi, the lunch breaks on his work days when he had a measure of privacy out on the rolling hills to study pages from the Bible. These moments gave him strength to live a Christian example for one more day. During one of these lunch breaks, the prisoner to whom he had given the first regulation approached him. "Old Wang, listen to this. You shall have no other gods before me." Mr. Wang beamed and scribbled down the second regulation on a piece of toilet paper and handed it to his fellow prisoner. "Don't forget to destroy the paper. Memorize this second regulation. Repeat it to me, then I'll give you the next one." The inmate stuck the paper in his pocket. As the work unit lined up for the afternoon's harvesting, Mr. Wang had a merry heart, hoping that inmate might learn to love the real God. Was this the reason why his friend had allowed him to come to the hard labor camp? That evening in his niche, Mr. Wang reread the cherished collection of letters from his children. He felt happy that his daughters were doing well in school and promised that when they graduated, they wouldn't take jobs offered by the government that conflicted with their Sabbath keeping. Their gifts of medicine and moral support strengthened him to brave yet another day in prison. The quiet ended abruptly when armed guards burst in with the prisoner with whom he had shared 2 regulations. "Did you give him this?" a guard demanded, holding out a note he had given the prisoner. He had been betrayed. Another prisoner to avoid. Wondering what merit the prisoner had been offered, he replied, "The note is one of the 10 regulations of Jesus, my friend. These laws are counter-revolutionary. You should be memorizing the sayings of Chairman Mao," the Judas declared. Knowing he'd broken the prison regulations against proselytizing and seeing the guns in the guards' hands, Mr. Wang dashed outside with the guards in hot pursuit. There, he fell to his knees as a terrible memory flashed into his mind. Sometime before, a guard's look had encouraged 2 quarreling prisoners to fight to the death. When the victor arose triumphant, expecting a reward, he was accused of murder. The prisoner protested, "You told me to kill him. I followed orders." Moments later, a bullet penetrated his skull. 2 prisoners had died without trial. Folding his hands, Mr. Wang prayed, "I'm willing to die, if that's what you want, but I'd rather live to be a witness in prison. Please don't let me die now." So intent was he in prayer that he paid no attention to the guards. After several minutes, he heard a familiar voice. The head of the guards, who had liked the Bible verse, "He who doesn't work won't eat." "What are you doing, criminal Wang?" the head guard asked. "Are you praying to your God?" "I'm talking to my friend, Jesus, the Son of the real God, telling him I'm not ready to die." "Your reaction seems natural," the head guard exclaimed. "My grandmother's a Christian, but her behavior made Christianity a joke. You must be a true Christian, criminal Wang." At that, the other guards left, leaving Mr. Wang praying until he felt certain all danger had passed. For a time, he was able to witness privately with little fear of repercussion from the guards. Then the guard, whose grandmother had been a Christian, completed his term of duty and was transferred out of the labor camp. A new supervisor named Yen replaced him. His arrival meant new problems. The weekend rolled around, and Mr. Wang prepared as usual to be absent from Sabbath work. He wrote out a request, wondering how Supervisor Yang would react. The end of chapter 17 of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed.